The lobby went silent the moment it happened. Not gradually, all at once. The way sound leaves a room when something occurs that no one has a script for. A woman in a $4,000 suit stood in the center of the marble floor. Her phone lay shattered at her feet, and the man she had just struck, the man whose job was to hold the door, whose name no one in that lobby had ever asked, stood exactly where he had been standing. He did not step back. He did not raise his hands. He simply straightened, slowly, deliberately, and looked at her with the eyes of someone who had survived things she could not imagine, in places she had never been, on a night that had quietly underwritten everything she owned. 30 people watched. No one moved. Then the bodyguard behind her saw something. A scar, pale, curved, running along the man's left wrist, and all the color left his face. His coffee cup hit the marble, shattered. He was already moving, because he recognized that scar. He had watched it form. The lobby went silent the moment it happened. Not gradually, all at once. The way sound leaves a room when something occurs that no one has a script for. A woman in a $4,000 suit stood in the center of the marble floor. Her phone lay shattered at her feet, and the man she had just struck, the man whose job was to hold the door, whose name no one in that lobby had ever asked, stood exactly where he had been standing. He did not step back. He did not raise his hands. He simply straightened, slowly, deliberately, and looked at her with the eyes of someone who had survived things she could not imagine, in places she had never been, on a night 15 years gone that nobody in this building knew had happened. 30 people watched. No one moved. Then the man standing just behind her saw something. A scar, pale, curved, running along the security guard's left wrist, exposed where his sleeve had shifted when he crouched to pick up her phone. And all the color left his face. His coffee cup dropped from his fingers, hit the marble, shattered. People nearby looked toward the sound, and then back at the guard, and then at the woman in the gray suit, and nobody understood what they were seeing except the man whose cup had just broken, and he was already moving, because he recognized that scar. He had watched it form. The lobby of Hollins Group smelled like money, not in any obvious way. Not perfume or leather or fresh flowers, though there were fresh flowers. White lilies replaced every Monday morning by a service that charged more per arrangement than Harold Brooks made in a week. It was something underneath all that. Something in the recycled air and the polished stone and the silence of a place where everyone understood, without being told, exactly what their role was and exactly how much it cost to stand inside these walls. Harold understood his role. He stood at the main entrance, left side, 6 feet from the revolving door, exactly where the post required him to stand. Black uniform, shoes polished the way his father had taught him, 2 coats, buff between, radio clipped to his left shoulder. He had worked this post for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. He knew the lobby the way a sailor knows a deck in the dark. Every crack in the marble he'd learned without trying. Every draft that came through when the revolving door picked up speed. Every camera angle. Every blind spot. He knew, for instance, that the camera above the east elevator had been pointed 4 degrees off-center since November. Maintenance had been notified twice. Nobody fixed it. Harold had stopped reporting it. The morning crowd moved through the way it always did on Mondays. A kind of Monday energy that wasn't quite refreshed and wasn't quite defeated. People in suits carrying the weight of a weekend they hadn't fully set down yet. Executives with coffee cups gripped like weapons. Junior associates checking phones with the focused panic of people who'd been answering emails since Saturday. A group of 3 men in matching gray, contractors probably, the kind who showed up quarterly with laptops and spoke in acronyms and left without ever learning anyone's name. Harold watched all of it, not because he was suspicious, not because anyone had told him to watch. He watched because watching was what he did. It was as natural to him as breathing, this habit of attention, this cataloging of small details that most people walked for right past, the woman in the blue blazer, who always checked her reflection in the elevator doors before they opened, as if the 10 seconds in the lobby might have changed something. The older gentleman from the 14th floor who arrived at 7:49 every single morning without fail, and held the door for whoever was behind him without looking back, an act so automatic it had long since stopped being courtesy and become character. The male courier who took the stairs instead of the elevator because Harold had eventually figured out she was claustrophobic and too proud to say so. He noticed people, which was funny in a way that wasn't particularly funny because nobody noticed him, not in any hostile sense, not with deliberate effort. They simply moved through the space he occupied the way water moves around a post, without awareness, without friction, without memory of having done it at all. He was part of the architecture, present and therefore invisible, essential and therefore unremarked upon. His left hand rested at his side. The cuff of his sleeve sat exactly where it always did, covering most of the scar, leaving the faintest edge of it visible if you were standing close enough, and paying the kind of attention that nobody standing close enough ever paid. The scar ran along the inside of his wrist in a pale, curved line, thinner than a finger but deep in the memory of what it had once been. A wound that a surgeon at Grady Memorial had spent 40 minutes closing while Harold sat on a gurney and thought, with remarkable calm, about whether the woman on the third floor had made it out before the ceiling gave. She had. He'd confirmed it himself before leaving the parking lot that night. Before anyone thought to ask his name, before any of the cameras outside found him in the crowd. That was 15 years ago. Harold shifted his weight slightly. Checked the time without making it obvious. A skill he'd perfected, small adjustments that looked like nothing from the outside. 7:47. Patricia Hollins arrived between 7:50 and 8 on Mondays, later on Thursdays when she had her early board calls from home. He knew her schedule the way he knew everything about this lobby. Not because anyone had briefed him, because he paid attention, and paying attention had kept him alive once, and old habits do not release their grip simply because the stakes have changed. The revolving door pushed a breath of October air through the lobby. A young analyst, Harold recognized from the 22nd floor, came through, nodded in his direction. Not quite at him, somewhere near him, the way people nodded at objects they appreciated without thinking about, and headed for the elevator bank. Harold nodded back with the same precision. He did everything, clean, no excess. He thought about Keisha Dillard. He did this sometimes, when the morning was slow and the lobby moved through its ordinary rhythms. Keisha Dillard, 26, who had worked night shifts at a warehouse distribution center in Decatur until a pallet collapse left her with 3 fractured vertebrae, and a company that filed the incident as employee error within 48 hours of it happening. She had called Anchor Point 6 weeks ago. Harold had spent 4 nights that week on the phone, with her, with the insurance adjuster, with a labor attorney named Brenda, who worked out of a shared office space in East Point, and had never once asked Harold how he'd found her number. Keisha had a daughter, 7 years old, named after Keisha's grandmother. Harold was still waiting on a callback from the insurance company's regional office. He had left 3 messages. He would leave a 4th tonight after his shift, sitting at the desk in his apartment in West End with the window cracked and the city doing what it did outside. Moving, building, generating the particular noise of a place that never fully stopped. This was the other thing nobody knew about the man who stood at the entrance of Hollins Group every weekday morning. The part that existed outside the lobby, outside the uniform, outside the role that made him invisible. Anchor Point Foundation had no office, no staff beyond Harold himself, and 2 volunteers who helped on weekends. No website beyond the minimal one required for the nonprofit filing, listing nothing but a phone number and a post office box in West End. No social media presence, no grant applications that required a founder's biography, no press releases, no interviews. 847 workers in 8 years. Harold carried the number, the way some people carried anniversaries. The revolving door turned again. A pair of women from the legal department, mid-conversation, not pausing it for the transition from outside to inside. A security consultant Harold had seen before. 3rd visit this month, which meant someone upstairs was worried about something. Then, a gap of maybe 90 seconds, where the lobby settled into a low hum of elevator chimes and shoe leather on marble, and the distant sound of the cafe on the mezzanine level beginning to fill with the first wave of of people who needed coffee before they could locate their professional selves. Harold looked at the revolving door, then he looked at the clock. 7:52. Patricia Hollins came through the revolving door at 7:53, and the lobby shifted the way it always did when she entered. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a subtle reorientation, like a room of compass needles responding to a change in the field. People moved slightly differently. Conversations finished faster. Posture corrected itself without anyone deciding to correct it. She was 45 and looked exactly as 45 looked on someone who had never in their adult life stopped moving long enough for age to find a comfortable position. Sharp features. A gray suit tailored close enough that it had clearly been built for the way she carried herself, not purchased off a rack and adjusted later. Phone in her right hand, screen lit, thumb moving across it, with the focused speed of someone who had been answering messages since before sunrise. Kevin Moore trailed half a step behind her left shoulder, tablet in hand, talking at a pace that suggested he was recapping a conversation that had started in the car. Two other members of her staff, Harold knew their faces, not their names, completed the formation on her right. Jeffrey Lewis brought up the rear. Harold had a complicated relationship with the act of not staring, and it tested him now. Jeffrey Lewis, 52, 6'2", built like someone who had spent a significant portion of his life in situations that required being 6'2", and built that way, had been Patricia Hollins' head of security for 10 years. He moved with the economy of a man who had learned, probably in a burning building or something equally unforgiving, to conserve everything, movement, energy, attention, and spend it only where it counted. Harold did not know Jeffrey Lewis personally. They had exchanged perhaps 40 words in 2 years and 3 months. Professional courtesies, shift handoffs, the kind of nodding acknowledgement that existed between two people who understood the same things about the same work and had nothing to prove to each other. What Harold knew was that Jeffrey Lewis had been Atlanta Fire Rescue, Station 19, 12 years before a shoulder injury ended it. He knew this because Harold knew how to find things out without being noticed, and because the Meridian fire had not been a small event in certain circles. And in those circles, certain names came up, again and again, in the careful way that people mentioned things they hadn't stopped thinking about. Jeffrey Lewis was one of those names. Harold had known for 8 months that Jeffrey Lewis worked in this building. He had made a choice about what to do with that information, which was to do nothing because doing nothing was very often the most considered action available, and Harold had made a practice of considered action for 15 years. He watched Patricia Hollins cross the lobby without looking up from her phone. 20 feet. 15. The revolving door had already deposited the group and moved on to the next entrant. A man with a briefcase who stepped through, registered the formation ahead, and made a small sideways correction to avoid it, the way you stepped around furniture you'd learned to expect in the dark. Harold's hand was already moving toward the door. Standard procedure. He pulled the right side door. The non-revolving panel set into the alcove beside the main entrance, to the open position, and held it for the incoming group, as he did for anyone approaching from that angle, as the post required, as he had done approximately 400 times across 2 years and 3 months. The door was 90% open. Patricia Hollins was still looking at her phone. She hit the edge of the door frame, not hard, not the full collision it might have been, but enough. Her right shoulder caught the edge of the glass panel as the door reached its full open position a half second too late. She made a sound, sharp, involuntary, the kind that comes before the mind has processed what the body just experienced. Her phone jumped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor with a crack that carried to the far end of the lobby, screened down. The entire group stopped. Kevin Moore reached out automatically and touched her elbow, which she moved away from without looking at him. The 2 staff members behind her froze in the posture of people calculating whether a response was expected of them. Patricia Hollins looked at Harold, half a second, maybe less, and she slapped him, open hand, right side of his face. The sound was nothing like the sound people imagined when they imagined that sound. Not cinematic, not the exaggerated crack from movies. Flatter, more abrupt. The sound of a palm meeting a cheekbone in a marble lobby on a Monday morning, in front of everyone. Before anyone had time to register what was coming, Harold's head moved with it. Not far. He had good equilibrium and a long history of absorbing impact and continuing to function. His head turned to the right and then he brought it back. He did not step back. He did not raise his hands. He stood exactly where he had been standing when it happened. Same post, same posture. And he breathed through the side of his face that was now radiating heat in a very familiar way. And he looked at Patricia Hollins with the expression that 15 years of practiced restraint had built in him. Not blank, not cold, not performing calm. Simply present, simply clear. She was looking at him the way people look when they've done something, and the adrenaline is still louder than the awareness of what they've done. Her jaw was set. Her phone was on the floor. Her shoulder hurt. He could see it in the angle she held herself, slightly protective on the right side. The lobby had gone quiet in the way that lobbies go quiet when something occurs that nobody has a script for. 30-something people. Harold had done a rough count before the incident out of habit. 30-something people in varying positions across the lobby floor, at the elevator banks, near the security desk, coming through the revolving door mid-stride, and slowing as they registered the altered atmosphere. A barista at the mezzanine counter above them, who had stopped mid-pour and was staring down. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, Harold said, his voice measured and quiet enough that the people nearest had to pay attention to catch it. "Ma'am." The door was opening. He crouched down, picked up her phone, stood back up, set it on the raised edge of the security counter to his left, face up, with the same care he gave to everything. The screen was cracked in the lower right quadrant. The phone was still on. Then he turned and walked back to his position, 6 feet from the revolving door, left side, and stood there. Patricia Hollins stood where she was for 3 seconds. Harold counted them, not because he needed to, but because counting gave him something to do with the part of his mind that was managing the warmth spreading across his cheekbone. Her 2 staff members had found their posture again. Kevin Moore was looking at his tablet with the concentration of someone whose brain was fully occupied with something other than what was on the screen. The people near the elevator banks had resumed their slow drift, except quieter. Not as cold, except with the sideways attention of people, pretending not to have seen what they'd seen. Patricia Hollins picked up the thread of whatever she'd been saying to Kevin Moore and continued it without missing a beat, and the group moved toward the executive elevator, and the lobby absorbed them the way it absorbed everything, smoothly, without visible evidence that anything had shifted, except that something had shifted. Harold felt it. He suspected the barista upstairs felt it. He suspected the man who'd been walking through the revolving door mid-stride felt it, because that man was now standing just inside the entrance, looking at his own phone, with the concentrated effort of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Harold stood at his post. His face hurt. He breathed. Behind him and to the left, near the service corridor entrance, Jeffrey Lewis had not moved. Harold knew this because Harold always knew where everyone in the lobby was, and because in the 30 seconds since the incident, the only people who had remained completely still, who had not drifted or resumed or recovered, were Harold himself and the man who had once been trapped behind a boiler room door in a burning building and spent the next 12 years trying not to think too carefully about who had gotten him out. Harold did not look at Jeffrey Lewis. He stood at his post and watched the revolving door and felt his face, and thought about Keisha Dillard's 4th voicemail, because thinking about that was more useful than anything else available to him right now, and Harold Brooks was, above everything, a man who did useful things. His left hand rested at his side. The cuff of his sleeve had shifted when he crouched to pick up the phone. The scar was visible at the edge of it. He didn't notice he hadn't pulled the cuff back down. The lobby moved on. Something else didn't. The service corridor behind the main lobby had the honest smell of a building's interior. Cleaning products, recycled air, the faint electrical tang of equipment that ran without pause and was never discussed. No marble back here, painted cinder block, and institutional lighting, and the sound of the HVAC system, audible, in a way it wasn't in the lobby, where the architecture had been designed to muffle such reminders that a building was, underneath everything, a machine. Harold was halfway to the equipment room when he heard footsteps behind him. Not the tentative footsteps of someone unsure they should be back here. Certain footsteps. The footsteps of someone who moved the same way through every space, because where you were had never changed how you moved. Harold stopped. He didn't turn around right away. He finished the step he was already taking, let his heel settle, and then turned. Jeffrey Lewis stood at the corridor entrance. He'd come through the service door, which required a key card that Jeffrey Lewis had because Patricia Hollins' head of security had access to every door in the building. His face was doing something Harold had not seen in 2 years and 3 months of professional acquaintance. Something complicated, not distressed. Jeffrey Lewis did not appear to be a man who accessed distress easily or often. Something else. The expression of a man whose internal catalog, extensive, organized, maintained over decades, had just found a match it had stopped expecting to find. The corridor was empty except for them. Jeffrey's voice came out lower than Harold had heard it before, stripped of the professional register he used in every room above ground. Meridian. 3rd floor. The corridor that wasn't on the map. Harold's body registered the words before his mind finished processing them. A stillness came over him. Not surprise exactly, because Harold had known for 8 months that this building contained someone who had been at Meridian, and he had known, in the way you know things you've decided not to examine too closely, that this moment existed somewhere ahead of him in time. But knowing something in the abstract and standing in a cinderblock corridor while it arrives are a different experience. Entirely. He looked at Jeffrey Lewis. And, he said, his voice as level as he could make it, because there was only one thing to say. Boiler room door. The east wall. You were the one stuck behind it. Jeffrey Lewis's right hand came up and pressed flat against the cinder block. Not for support, exactly. More like he needed to verify that something solid was still in its expected position. I've been looking, Jeffrey said. 15 years. I looked. Harold understood this. He also understood why the looking hadn't found anything, because Harold had spent 15 years being unfindable in a way that required deliberate effort rather than luck. No social media, no news coverage. He'd moved before the local story ran in the morning editions, when the chaos outside the Meridian plant was still the kind of chaos that hadn't yet sorted itself into individuals. A name that appeared on a non-profit filing with a post office box and a phone number and nothing else. He had not been hiding. That was the distinction he'd drawn for himself early on and maintained. He had simply been working, and the working didn't require him to be found. He looked at Jeffrey Lewis and said, "How long have you been in this building?" Not a question. Jeffrey heard it as what it was. 10 years. Then you've been in this building 2 years longer than I have. Jeffrey's jaw worked for a moment. I didn't know. I would have. He stopped. Restarted. I didn't know until just now. The scar. I saw it when you picked up her phone. Harold looked down at his left wrist. The cuff was still pushed up. He pulled it down, not quickly, not with emphasis. Just correcting something that had shifted out of place. How long have you known I was here? Jeffrey said. Harold considered the question. He had always thought it was possible that Jeffrey would ask this, if this moment ever happened, and he had always thought he would answer it honestly. 8 months, the number landed in the corridor between them. Jeffrey absorbed it. He was, Harold noted, a man who received information without a lot of visible reaction, a trait Harold respected because it was his own trait and it was useful. 8 months, Jeffrey said. When you started, I was already established here. I calculated the likelihood of. Harold paused, finding the right word. Disruption. And you decided against it. I decided it wasn't necessary. Jeffrey looked at him. You saved my life. Harold had heard this construction before. From people who'd been in that building. From the years that followed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had a response he'd settled into. The way you settle into a way of carrying something heavy. Not rehearsed but true. Shaped over time by repetition until it fit. I did what was in front of me. You would have done the same. I was a firefighter. That was literally my job description. You were also stuck behind a door with 3 inches of clearance. because you'd gone back in to look for a 16-year-old who'd already gotten out through the west stairwell. That's not job description. That's who you are. Jeffrey looked at the floor. Not the way people looked at floors when they were embarrassed. The way they looked when they were recalculating something they thought they'd already figured out. Harold said, before Jeffrey could respond. The company that owned Meridian. Jeffrey's head came up. Harold let the sentence sit incomplete for a moment because he wanted Jeffrey to arrive at the destination himself, because it mattered that Jeffrey understood Harold had already arrived there a long time ago. Hollins Industries, which became Hollins Group, which is the company whose lobby I've been standing in for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. The corridor was very quiet. The HVAC hummed its institutional hum. Jeffrey Lewis, who had seen burning buildings and board meetings and 10 years of the pressures that came with protecting one of the most powerful executives in Atlanta, looked at Harold Brooks with an expression Harold could not fully name but recognized as containing something close to grief. You knew, Jeffrey said. When you took this job, I knew. Why? Harold thought about Keisha Dillard, about the welder from Lithuania, who'd lost partial function in his right hand and spent 14 months fighting a workers' comp claim, while his mortgage went 3 months past due. About the 19 people Anchor Point had supported through claims against Hollins Group subsidiaries over the past 6 years, 3 of which had resulted in formal settlements, all of which had required Harold to route the referrals through an intermediary attorney, so his name never appeared in any document that could be traced back to his employment at the building he was filing against. Because the people who get hurt in their facilities need someone with access, Harold said. Not legal access, just proximity, the ability to observe, to know which subcontractors they use, which safety protocols get skipped when there's a deadline, which middle managers sign off on things they're not qualified to assess. He paused. Information. That's all. Jeffrey Lewis sat down on a metal chair near the wall. The kind of chair that appeared in service corridors without explanation, materialized the way certain objects did in institutional spaces, as though the building itself needed somewhere to put things that didn't belong anywhere else. He sat down and put his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance. The woman who just hit you, he said quietly, is the same person who saved 43 people from a burning building that her father owned. Harold said nothing. And in the last 6 years, you've been helping workers file claims against subsidiaries of that same company. Harold said nothing. While standing at their front door, I clock in at 7:30, Harold said. I clock out at 4. What I do on my own time is my own business. Jeffrey looked at him for a long moment. What you're doing is extraordinary. Harold felt the familiar friction of that word. The slight resistance of someone who had spent years watching people call things extraordinary that he thought of simply as necessary. Things that were what needed doing, described through a lens that couldn't account for why anyone would do them without a different motivation than the one Harold actually had. What I'm doing, Harold said, is making phone calls and filling out paperwork. Most of what needs to change in this world changes through phone calls and paperwork. Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. Then, why didn't you ever come forward? After Meridian, the official record has someone else's name on it. The corridor felt slightly smaller. Harold had known this question was coming, in the vicinity of all the previous ones, and he had an answer for it. A longer answer, the whole version. And he looked at the man across from him and decided to give it. I left the building at 11:47 p.m., Harold said. There were 7 news vans outside, and a fire marshal, trying to account for everyone, and about 200 people milling around who'd been told to move back from the perimeter. I knew the official rescue team had reached the floors I'd been on. I knew everyone I'd guided out had made it to the staging area. I confirmed that myself before I left. My work was done. He paused. A man named Donald Thomas was standing in front of the cameras. He was describing what he called his coordination of the rescue operation. He was describing events that had not occurred in the order he was describing them, in some cases, events that had not occurred at all. And there were people listening to him who needed to believe a man with a title had saved them, because that was easier than believing in the series of improbable things that had actually happened. Another pause. I decided it wasn't worth the fight, Jeffrey said. He got a safety commendation, I know. He built his entire consulting career on that story. I know that too. Jeffrey was quiet again. Harold waited. This was another skill, the patience to let silence do its work, to not fill gaps simply because they existed, and gaps made people uncomfortable. Gaps served a purpose. They gave information room to settle into the space it occupied. Finally, Jeffrey said, carefully, she needs to know. Harold looked at his wrist. The cuff was down. He adjusted it slightly, automatic. Why? Because what just happened in that lobby? What happened in that lobby is between me and Ms. Hollins, and I have every intention of handling it through appropriate channels. That's not what I mean. Jeffrey met his eyes. She runs a company that exists in part because of what you did. She spent 15 years not knowing that. She stood in that lobby this morning and hit you, and she does not know what she hit. She thinks she hit a security guard. He stopped. Then, she needs to know what she actually hit. Harold studied the man across from him, Jeffrey Lewis. He thought, was a person with a strong enough moral imagination to feel the weight of something, even when it didn't belong to him. That was a quality Harold had encountered rarely enough to notice it when he did. He said, what happens after she knows? I don't know. Then we're discussing a significant disruption for an outcome that's currently undefined. Yes. Harold looked at the wall. The company memo, he said. Internal. Dated about 6 weeks after the fire. It recommends locating the unnamed individual who guided workers to safety and offering compensation, citing both ethical obligation and favorable optics during the litigation period. Jeffrey waited. The memo is on page 47 of the Meridian incident file, Harold said. The file exists in the Hollins Group archive. I've read a copy of it. The recommendation was signed by 3 executives. It was never actioned. There's a follow-up note, a single line, noting that the search had been, he paused, deprioritized. How do you have a copy of the file? Harold looked at him. There were things Harold didn't explain, not out of evasion. Out of the understanding that some answers created more problems than the questions they closed, and that Jeffrey Lewis was smart enough to know that Harold's access to internal documents was both intentional and the result of 8 months of patient proximity. Jeffrey let it go. Which was the right choice. What do you want to do? Jeffrey said. Harold thought about this the way he thought about everything that mattered, not quickly. He thought about Keisha Dillard in her apartment, waiting. About the 4th voicemail. About a ceiling coming down in sections, but just the sound of it. Not imagined, but remembered. The difference still clear to him after 15 years. The way certain sounds lived in the body rather than the mind. About the weight of a child between his shoulder blades on the way through a corridor that hadn't appeared on any rescue map. He thought about the lobby. The marble. The 30-something people who had watched and not moved. I want to get back to my post, Harold said. Jeffrey stood. He moved toward the corridor entrance and stopped, and without turning around. She'll find out, with or without us. Videos already spreading, Harold said nothing. When she finds out, Jeffrey said, she should hear it from people who were there. Not from a comment section. He walked back through the service door. It closed behind him with the soft click of a building doing what buildings did, receiving people, releasing them, keeping no record of the difference. Harold stood in the corridor for 11 seconds. He counted them, not because counting was necessary, but because it was something to do with the part of his mind that hadn't fully returned to baseline, yet. Then he walked back to his post. The rest of that morning had the texture of a day that has already decided what it's going to be about, regardless of what anyone had scheduled. Harold stood at his post, and the lobby moved around him, and he watched it all with the same attention he always brought. People moved through the space he occupied and did not see him. This was not different from any other morning. The difference was in what existed underneath it, in the specific weight of the day pressing down on every ordinary motion, the way a barometric change makes itself known before the weather does. At 9:47, Kevin Moore came through the lobby, heading toward the parking structure, talking into his phone, and returned 12 minutes later, with the compressed expression of someone who'd been told to expedite something important and had already started. At 10:15, 3 people Harold recognized as upper management gathered near the south elevator bank and had a conversation in the register of people who believed they were being quiet while definitively not being quiet. Harold caught fragments, the words video and board and legal in combinations that told him the shape of things without requiring the specific. His personal phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He kept it on silent during shifts and checked it only in the corridor during his mid-morning equipment round. He didn't check it now. He stood at his post. At 11:20, Deborah from HR, small woman, mid-50s, who always had 2 pens, clipped to her lanyard, and who Harold knew from overheard conversations was 12 days from retirement, came through the lobby, walking the way people walked when they were carrying news somewhere and hadn't decided yet whether it was the kind of news you walked fast with or slow with. She chose slow. She went to the executive elevator and stood there and looked at her pens for a moment before the doors opened. The video had been filmed by someone near the east elevator bank. Harold had registered the phone in peripheral vision the moment it appeared. The horizontal hold, the angle, the tell of someone who'd started recording before they'd fully committed to the decision, which meant the footage began before the incident rather than after it. 5, maybe 6 seconds. Enough to catch the slap. Enough to catch the after. Not enough to catch the before, because nobody thought something was going to happen until it already had. He had been in this shape before. Not these specifics. The general shape of a day. When something had occurred, and the ripples of it were still moving out through the water, and you stood in the middle and watched them go, knowing they would hit things before they stopped. The difference was that this time, the ripples had 15 years of distance to cross before they reached what Harold knew was in their path. At 12:41, Jeffrey Lewis came back through the lobby. He did not stop. He did not look at Harold directly. He went to the security desk, checked something on the monitor there, exchanged a few words with the afternoon desk officer, and on his way back toward the elevator bank, allowed himself the smallest adjustment in direction that brought him within earshot for precisely the time it took to say. Without looking at Harold, without breaking his pace, "She's pulling the Meridian file, all of it." He kept walking. Harold stood at his post. He breathed 43 workers. A corridor that wasn't on any map, a ceiling that came down in sections, and he could still hear it on certain nights, with the exact acoustics of recalled sound, distinct from the sound of imagined things, the kind of memory that had settled into the body and stayed there regardless of how much time passed. A man standing in front of cameras describing events that had not occurred, a memo on page 47, a single line deprioritized. Harold looked at the revolving door. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it did, moving, building, tearing down, building again, all of it proceeding at the pace of a city that had burned once and rebuilt, and didn't stop for much of anything afterward. He had lived in this city his whole life, knew it street by street the way you knew a place whose losses had also been your losses, whose history sat in your chest, alongside your own. He thought about what Jeffrey had said. She should hear it from people who were there. He thought about page 47. He thought about Donald Thomas, 63 years old, who had an office in Buckhead and a framed photograph with the governor and a reputation assembled from another man's night in a burning building, and who had. Harold knew this from public business records he'd reviewed after taking the Hollins job, been on retainer as a strategic consultant for Hollins Group for the past 4 years. Present in the building Harold worked in, drawing a check from the company whose parent had deprioritized, finding the person whose actions had made the survival of that company possible. He thought about the workers' comp case he had not yet filed for the Lithonia welder, because the statute of limitations had 3 months on it, and he needed 2 more pieces of documentation and a medical expert who would take a call from a nonprofit with no name recognition and a post office box in West End. The afternoon crowd was different from the morning crowd. Lighter, more dispersed. The lunch hour had rearranged people and the building breathed differently in the early afternoon, the metabolism of a structure between the urgencies of opening and the compression of close. Harold stood at his post. His face had stopped hurting around 10 a.m., faster than he'd expected, though the warmth of impact left a kind of memory in the skin that was distinct from pain. A reminder, rather than a symptom, something that would fade by morning and leave nothing visible. He thought, with the practiced quiet of a man who had made a discipline of not needing things, about what it meant to be this close to a truth for this long. He had known when he took the job at Hollins Group exactly what he was walking into. He had known about the memo. He had known about Donald Thomas and the commendation and the story that had been told for 15 years in place of the story that had actually happened. He had known that the company Patricia Hollins ran had been built in part on a foundation that included, somewhere in its load-bearing structure, the fact of Harold Brooks moving through a smoke-filled corridor on a Tuesday night in November and refusing to leave without everyone who needed to leave. He had made a choice, eyes open. The way he did everything, the choice was not about what he deserved. Harold had a complicated relationship with that concept, rooted in something his father had told him when he was 12, and which he had turned over in his mind so many times since that it had become less a memory and more a permanent texture of his thinking. You don't do what's right because you'll get credit for it. You do it because you'll have to live in the world it creates. The world the Meridian fire had created was a world where 43 people had gone home to their families, where the Hollins Group had survived a catastrophe that should have ended it, where a company now worth several $1 billion sat on a foundation that included Harold's Tuesday night and the 40 minutes of surgery at Grady Memorial and the arm he'd kept. He had not done it for credit. He had never expected credit. He had expected nothing, and nothing was largely what he had received. And that had felt, for most of 15 years, like a reasonable arrangement. What it felt like now was slightly different, not because of the slap. The slap was a single morning in a long series of mornings. He had taken harder impacts, in more consequential circumstances, and walked back to his position each time. It was because of Jeffrey Lewis saying she should hear it from people who were there, and because of the image Harold now had of Patricia Hollins on the 38th floor, pulling a file he had read a copy of years ago, reading toward page 47, with the momentum of someone who didn't yet know what she was going to find when she got there. He turned that image over. The revolving door pushed another breath of October air into the lobby. Harold adjusted his cuff, stood at his post, and for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, allowed himself to think carefully about what happened next. The second-floor conference room at Hollins Group was designed for the kind of meetings that didn't need to impress anyone. No floor-to-ceiling glass, no Atlanta panorama, a rectangular table, 8 chairs, overhead lighting that was adequate without being architectural, a whiteboard on the north wall with a faint ghost of old marker text that the cleaning crew had never fully erased. The room smelled like the combination of dry erase markers and recycled air that every conference room in every building smelled like, which was the smell of decisions being made by people in chairs. Harold arrived 2 minutes before the scheduled time. He had not changed out of his uniform because his shift started at 7:30 and the meeting was at 7, and he was not going to be late for work because of a meeting, and because the uniform was what he wore to this building. And he did not think what he wore to the meeting would change what happened in it. Patricia Hollins was already in the room when he arrived. She was sitting on the guest side of the table, not at the head, not in the power position, just at the middle of one long side, which Harold noted. She had a legal pad, a pen, a glass of water she hadn't touched. She looked like someone who had not slept well, which was accurate, and who had made a decision about how she was going to conduct the next hour, which was also accurate, and who was uncertain whether the decision was the right one, which she was. Harold pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She said, "Thank you for coming," he said. "You requested the meeting, a beat." "I did." She looked at the legal pad, then at him. "I want to apologize for what happened in the lobby. It was wrong. There is no context that makes it appropriate, and I'm not going to offer context as though it were an excuse." Harold listened to this. He had thought about what Patricia Hollins might say in this room, and this was close to what he'd expected. Direct, without performance, the apology of someone who was capable of accountability when she chose to exercise it. He waited until she finished before he said anything. "I accept that," he said. "And I want you to understand that when I say that, I mean it without condition. The apology is accepted." He paused. "The matter I want to discuss is separate." Something shifted in her posture, not defensiveness, more the adjustment of someone who had expected a longer approach to the point. "Go ahead." Harold put both hands flat on the table. "Donald Thomas is currently on retainer with this company. He has been for 4 years. His retainer is renewed annually. His consulting scope includes strategic risk assessment, which means he has access to internal documents and relationships that most external contractors don't have." Patricia said nothing. Waiting, Donald Thomas has been describing himself as Tuscompré actor in the Meridian rescue for 15 years. He has received professional recognition, financial benefit, and reputational standing on the basis of that description. The description is false. He was outside the building that night. He was useful, he was organized, he managed the staging area, he did real work, but he was not inside. He did not guide those workers out, and the person who did has never received any acknowledgement, financial or otherwise. From this company, the room was quiet. Patricia Hollins looked at Harold Brooks with the attention Jeffrey had asked her to bring. Without the overlay of role or context or the habit of not quite seeing that had gotten her to yesterday morning, she looked at his left hand, where the cuff sat exactly where it always sat. She said, her voice careful and lower than her usual register. "You were there," Harold said. "Yes." The words sat in the conference room and neither of them moved for a moment. The overhead lights did what overhead lights did. Somewhere outside the room a phone rang and was answered, and the building continued its operations. And inside the room a 15-year-old fact was finally in a place where it could be heard by the person who most needed to hear it. Patricia said, "Why did you take this job?" Harold said, "Because the people who get hurt in your facilities needed someone with proximity to information, not authority." "Information," he paused. "I've helped 9 people with claims against Hollins Group's subsidiaries in 6 years. 3 resulted in formal settlements. Those 9 people got medical care and financial support, and a fair process that they wouldn't have had without someone who understood the system from the inside." Patricia looked at the legal pad, looked back, "While you were working our front door. Every morning, she sat with that." He let her. Then she said, and her voice had lost the last of its professional distance, "We had a memo, page 47, recommending we find you, make it right. I know about the memo. We didn't follow up. No. Donald Thomas signed the deprioritization order. Yes." She pressed her hand flat on the table, a gesture that mirrored his without either of them having planned it. 2 people on opposite sides of something, both with their hands on the surface between them, both looking for what was solid. She said, "I want to do what's right. I need you to tell me what that looks like. Not for optics, not for the board. For you to look at me and tell me this was addressed." Harold looked at her for a long moment, and what he said next was not what she expected, and not what anyone watching would have predicted, and it was the truest thing he had said in a room with another person in a very long time. "It's not about me," he said. "It has never been about me. What I need you to understand is that I am a case file. I am one person who walked into one building one night and walked out and moved on. There are 900 other people who didn't have a Tuesday night in November, who just had a factory floor, or a warehouse dock, or a loading bay, and a company that decided their medical bills were a line item, and their suffering was a liability to be managed down." He paused. "If you want to do what's right, start there. Start with the people who don't have anyone at the front door." Patricia Hollins sat very still, and for the first time in the meeting, she looked not like a CEO running a calculation or a woman managing a crisis, but like a person who had just been handed information that was going to change how she understood the room she'd been living in. She nodded once, slowly. The nod of someone making a commitment, not acknowledging a point. Harold pushed back his chair and stood. He had a shift starting in 30 minutes, and a fourth voicemail to leave for an insurance adjuster, and a case file for Keisha Dillard that needed 2 more documents before it was ready to move. At the door he stopped. He turned back. Not because he had forgotten something, but because there was one more thing and he had decided, standing up, that it was worth saying. Miss Hollins. The building your father built is still standing. It employs 6,000 people. The reason it's still standing is partly because of the work he did and the work you've done, and partly because 43 people came home in November instead of not coming home. He met her eyes. That's not a debt. I don't want it to be a debt, but it is a fact. And facts have weight whether we acknowledge them or not. He left. The conference room held her alone, with the legal pad, and the untouched glass of water, and the faint ghost of old marker text on the whiteboard, and she sat there for 11 minutes. She checked the time when she came in, and checked it again when she finally stood. And in those 11 minutes she made 3 decisions that would take the better part of a year to fully execute, and that would change, in ways both visible and invisible. The shape of the company, and the lives of people who would never know her name. Then she went upstairs and called Kevin Moore and told him to find everything currently on file related to worker injury claims against any Hollins Group subsidiary, going back to 2018. And she called Stephanie Harris and told her the public statement would go out tomorrow, not today. And it would not follow any framework they'd used before. And then she sat at her desk and looked at her city and thought about the difference between looking at something and actually seeing it. Not as a philosophical exercise. As a practical question about what she had been doing every morning when she walked through her own building and what she was going to do differently starting now. The city moved outside the glass. It always moved. That was the thing about Atlanta. It never stopped long enough to let you get comfortable with what it was, because what it was kept changing. She had spent her career contributing to that change and calling it progress and believing in the label. She still believed in it. She just understood, sitting here with the files on her desk and a legal pad, with a single name on it and an untouched glass of water, that progress without reckoning was just motion. And motion without direction was just noise. She had some reckoning to do. She started tonight. The video was 23 seconds long. Patricia Hollins knew this because she had watched it 11 times by 7 a.m. the following morning, sitting at the kitchen island in her home in Cascade Heights, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the 4th viewing. 23 seconds. The clip started mid-lobby, slightly shaky, the framing of someone who had raised their phone horizontally before fully committing to the decision, which meant the first 2 seconds were establishing the scene rather than catching the incident, which meant the incident itself was on camera from the moment her hand moved. All of it. Clean, the warning sign in the lower left corner of the frame was visible from the second the clip started. Harold Brooks's posture after, the straightening, the stillness, the way he picked up her phone and set it on the counter, with the care of someone handling something that mattered. All of it captured. All of it going to be watched by people who would not have the context of a cracked screen, and a shoulder that still ached, and a morning that had been wrong before she even walked through the door. Text, she understood, was not a thing that traveled well in 23 seconds. By the time Kevin Moore arrived at her office at 8:15, the number had cleared 2 million views. By 8:40, her phone had received messages from 4 board members, 2 she spoke to regularly, and 2 she heard from only when something had gone significantly wrong. Her PR director, Stephanie Harris, had been in the building since 7, which was not Stephanie's habit, and therefore told Patricia everything she needed to know about the temperature of the situation. Before a single word was exchanged, Stephanie laid out the standard framework, with the efficient calm of someone who had navigated corporate crises before and believed in process the way other people believed in things they couldn't see. Immediate public statement. Acknowledge the incident without extensive characterization. Express commitment to reviewing internal protocols. Offer settlement to the affected employee through HR. Quietly, cleanly, before he retained outside counsel. Control the narrative window before it closed. because narrative windows closed faster than they used to, and the current one was already narrowing by the hour. Patricia listened to all of it. She sat behind her desk on the 38th floor with Atlanta spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and she listened to Stephanie Harris describe the playbook she had used successfully 3 times in her career. And when Stephanie finished, Patricia said, "Not yet." Stephanie's expression did not change. She had spent 20 years learning to receive unexpected information without visible reaction. But something in the quality of her stillness shifted in a way Patricia recognized. "Every hour we delay, I heard you." Patricia looked at her desk. On it was a legal pad, and on the legal pad was a single name she had written there the previous evening, Meridian. Below it 2 more words, PG-47. "I need more information before we put anything out." The information available right now is a video with 3 million views and a stock that opened down 4.2%. I know what the stock did. Patricia looked up. "Give me until tomorrow morning." Stephanie Harris picked up her portfolio from the chair. At the door, she paused. The second person in as many days to stop at Patricia's door with something remaining unsaid. And her voice had lost some of its professional register. "Patricia, don't let this become something it doesn't have to be." Patricia said nothing. The door closed. She looked at the legal pad, at the name, at the page number. She had read the Meridian file until 2 in the morning. All of it. Not just the sections Kevin had flagged. Not just the executive summary that someone had prepared years ago for a situation that was now 15 years past. The whole file. Incident reports and insurance correspondence and internal communications and the official fire marshal assessment and 3 separate legal memos from the period immediately following, when the company had been looking at potential liability exposure that could have ended it entirely. The memo on page 47 was not the only thing that had unsettled her, but it was the thing she kept returning to. Search for unidentified rescuer deprioritized. No further action required at this time. 7 words of active decision buried in the passive language of corporate administration. Someone had sat at a desk in a company her father ran, a company she now ran, a company whose name was on the building where she had stood that morning, and raised her hand against a man she had not looked at, and typed those words, and pressed send, and moved on to whatever was next on the calendar. Donald Thomas, Director of Operations, Hollins Industries, 2009. Currently, Strategic Consultant, Hollins Group. Retainer contract renewed annually since 2021. Patricia had pulled his consulting file after she finished the Meridian archive, reviewed his scope of work, his billing records, his 4 years of deliverables. He was good at what he did. She had no argument with the quality of his output. She had engaged him herself 2 years into her tenure on the recommendation of her CFO, who had worked with him before and trusted him. His name had been associated with the Meridian rescue for so long and so consistently that it had become background fact. The kind of fact you didn't verify because it had never given you a reason to. She called Kevin Moore at 8:53. "The Meridian incident file," she said when he picked up. "Pull everything associated with Donald Thomas. His personnel file from that period, his post-incident communications, any commendations, the safety medal documentation. And pull his current consulting contract." Kevin was quiet for 3 seconds. Significant for Kevin Moore, who was 28 and extremely fast, and had never once in 18 months of working for Patricia Hollins taken more than 1 second to respond to a direct request. All of it? All of it. Before noon, she hung up and looked out at Atlanta. The city did what it did, moved, built, tore down. The skyline she had watched change over 45 years. Through her father's window first, and then her own. The particular mix of glass and concrete and cranes that meant a city was still believing in itself. She had spent her career contributing to that skyline, had broken ground on 4 buildings visible from this window, had restructured a company that employed 6,000 people and kept them employed through a recession that had ended things for companies with less discipline and more ego. She had told the story of her own success. So many times she could hear it in her sleep. Built on the foundation her father laid. Expanded through discipline and instinct. Proof that what he'd started could outlast him and grow beyond what he'd imagined. The story had never included a Tuesday night in November, a corridor that wasn't on any map, a man whose name nobody had written down. She picked up her phone, found the video, watched it for the 12th time, but this time she didn't watch herself. She watched Harold Brooks, the way he moved when it was over, the quality of his stillness. Not the stillness of someone managing anger, not the stillness of someone calculating options. Something older than either of those things. The stillness of a man for whom this was not the hardest thing he had absorbed and continued past. She thought, "Who are you?" She already knew part of the answer. She needed the rest of it. Kevin Moore brought the files at 11:40. He set them on the desk without comment, which was the right choice, and left without being asked, which was also the right choice. And Patricia understood in that moment why she had kept him for 18 months. When she typically cycled through assistants, every 8. She read for 2 hours without interruption. Donald Thomas's personnel file from the Meridian period was thorough, in the way personnel files were thorough. Dates, positions, performance reviews that described a competent, organized operations director who managed his team efficiently and communicated well upward. The kind of review that told you exactly as much as the person writing it wanted you to know. His post-incident communications were what interested her. He had been on site the night of the fire. That much was accurate. He had coordinated with emergency services in the parking lot, managing the staging area, accounting for workers as they came out. This was in the fire marshal's report. This was real. He had been outside. He had been useful, organized, present, doing the work of a man who was trying to help in the way available to him. He had not been inside the building. Patricia found this not in any single document that said so directly, but in the accumulation of what was absent. No first-hand account of interior conditions in any of his statements. No reference to the third-floor corridor in any document attributed to him. His descriptions of the rescue, in the weeks and months and years after, grew more detailed over time in the way that stories grew more detailed when they were being constructed rather than remembered, gaining texture and precision in inverse proportion to their original substance. The safety commendation documentation described him as having coordinated and led rescue operations during the Meridian plant emergency, demonstrating exceptional crisis leadership that prevented significant loss of life. It was dated 6 weeks after the fire. The committee that awarded it included 3 names, 2 of whom had left the company within a year, and 1 of whom, Patricia, checked, had been on the company's board during the period when the legal exposure from Meridian was at its highest, with a direct financial interest in a narrative that credited the company's own personnel with the rescue rather than leaving that credit unassigned and unexplained. She sat back in her chair. The view behind her was unchanged. Atlanta, moving. The story it told from this height was always the same story. Momentum, the city as ongoing argument against standing still. She picked up her phone and called Jeffrey Lewis. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Hollins, come up." A pause brief enough that she almost missed it. 5 minutes, she looked at the files on her desk while she waited, thought about what it meant to run a company for 8 years, without knowing that the company existed in part because of something you had never examined. Thought about discipline and instinct and the story of her own rise, which she had told as a story of her own making. True in the ways that mattered, and incomplete in a way that had just become impossible to ignore. Jeffrey knocked and came in and stood the way he always stood. Not quite at ease, not quite formal, the posture of a man who was always, on some level, assessing the room he'd entered. "Sit down," Patricia said. He sat. "Tell me what you know about Harold Brooks." She said it as a statement, not a question, because she had seen his face in the lobby that morning when she'd watched the video for the 3rd time and noticed, for the first time, that Jeffrey Lewis had been standing completely still while everyone around him had started moving again. And she needed to hear it from the person who had seen something she hadn't. Jeffrey Lewis told her. He told it, the way he must have told very few things in his life, directly, without performance, in the order it had actually happened. The fire, the building, The smoke in concentrations that professional firefighters with equipment struggled through. The corridor on the third floor that appeared on no rescue map, through which a young man had guided workers one after another. Some of them injured, one of them a child belonging to a shift supervisor who had gotten out earlier, and whose daughter had been found by a coworker and handed to the first capable person moving in the right direction. He described the scar, how it had formed, the falling debris, the fact that the young man had not stopped moving when the metal came down. He described watching Harold Brooks pick up Patricia Hollins's phone from the lobby floor that morning and set it on the counter, with the precision of someone who made a practice of doing difficult things carefully. When Jeffrey finished, Patricia was quiet for a long time. "He's been working in this building for over 2 years," she said. "Yes." He knew. He knew everything. She looked at the window. "Why?" Jeffrey met her eyes. "You should ask him that. I'm asking you." A breath. "Because the people who get hurt in your facilities needed someone with access to information. Not authority, just proximity." He paused. "He's been running a nonprofit called Anchor Point Foundation for 8 years. Worker injury cases. He's helped nearly 900 people navigate claims, find attorneys, get medical support. Without his name attached to anything public." Patricia thought about the construction projects, the warehouses, the manufacturing subsidiaries that Hollins Group had operated or acquired over the years, the safety reports that crossed her desk quarterly, reviewed with the attention of someone who took compliance seriously, and the assumption of someone who had never personally stood on a factory floor, watching the gap between what the report said and what was actually happening. "He's filed claims against us," she said. 3, through intermediary attorneys. He won all 3, while standing at our front door. Every morning for 2 years, Patricia looked at the files on her desk, at the memo on page 47, at the consulting contract for Donald Thomas, who had built an entire career on credit that belonged to the man whose face she had struck that morning in front of 30 witnesses and a phone camera, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Set up a meeting. Harold Brooks, tomorrow morning. 2nd floor conference room. No staff, no counsel." Jeffrey stood. At the door he stopped, and when he turned, something in his face was different from the professional register he'd maintained for 10 years of working alongside her. "Patricia." She looked up. "Whatever you're thinking about saying to him, think about it again first. He doesn't need managing. He needs someone to actually look at him." He paused. "Maybe." For the first time in a long time, the door closed. Patricia Hollins sat in her office on the 38th floor for a long time after that. The stock closed down 4.8. 3 board members called. Stephanie Harris sent a draft statement she didn't open. She looked at page 47 until she had the language memorized. Then she called Kevin. Then she called and told him she was leaving for the evening. And she went home, and she sat in her kitchen with a glass of water she didn't drink. And she thought about who she was in a way she hadn't done since the early years when the company was newly hers, and everything felt uncertain, and the answer to the question had mattered for practical reasons. The answer now felt like it mattered for a different kind of reason, one she was still finding the words for. Angela Young had been a reporter for 22 years, which meant she had developed, over that time, the skill of knowing when a story was a story, and when a story was the surface of something considerably larger. The video of Patricia Hollins and Harold Brooks was a story. The video plus a deleted comment she had screenshotted at 11 p.m. Ask about Meridian. Ask about who really saved those 43 workers. Was the surface of something she needed to understand before she could write a single word of it. She started with the Meridian fire because starting with the fire was starting with facts, public record. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution's own archive, going back 15 years, had 6 pieces on it. The initial breaking news, 2 follow-up pieces on the rescue operation, 1 on the liability investigation, 1 profile of Donald Thomas after the safety commendation, 1 brief item 3 months later when the company settled with injured workers. And the story essentially stopped being news because settlements made things stop being news. The profile of Donald Thomas was the one she read 3 times. It described, in the language of a feature piece from 15 years ago, a man who had shown extraordinary composure and leadership in a crisis, who had personally coordinated the rescue of more than 40 workers from a burning building, who attributed his response to years of safety training and an instinct for keeping people calm under pressure. The piece included a photograph of Donald Thomas receiving the commendation, shaking hands with a regional official, looking exactly as a man looked when he was comfortable in the position he occupied. What the piece did not include, Angela noted, was a single direct quote from any survivor of the Meridian fire, confirming they had seen Donald Thomas inside the building. She pulled the fire marshal's official report through a public records request that came back in 4 hours. She had developed relationships at the Atlanta Fire Department over years of covering the city, and those relationships had practical value. The marshal's report documented the rescue operation in careful detail. It noted in a section on civilian assistance the presence of an unidentified individual who had guided workers through a service corridor on the 3rd floor. Described by multiple survivors as a young man with a wound on his left forearm, who had departed the scene before emergency personnel could obtain identification. Unidentified. Present in the official record. Unattributed, unacknowledged in any public-facing narrative. Angela called the first survivor on her list at 4 p.m., a man named Brian Thompson, 51, who had worked the machine floor at Meridian for 9 years before the fire and now ran a small equipment repair shop in Marietta. She had found him through the settlement records, which were partially public. Brian Thompson picked up on the 3rd ring, and when Angela explained who she was and what she was calling about, he was quiet long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then, I wondered when someone was going to ask. He told her about the corridor, about the person who had found them. He described the wound on the young man's forearm in detail consistent enough with the fire marshal's reference that Angela's pen was moving, before Brian finished his first sentence. He said, and his voice shifted on this, became more careful, "I never saw Donald Thomas inside that building. Not once. I saw him outside when we came out. He was on the phone. He had a clipboard." Angela called 4 more survivors that evening. All 4 were consistent on the same points. The corridor, the young man, the wound, the fact that he had stayed until the last person was through and then disappeared before anyone thought to ask his name. None of them had seen Donald Thomas inside the building. All of them, when asked about the commendation, went quiet in the way of people who had decided to live with something rather than fight it. One of them, a woman named Lisa, who had been 19 years old at the time and now lived in Smyrna and worked in logistics, said, "I thought about saying something. A lot of us did, but who were we going to say it to? The company had lawyers. The investigation was closed. The commendation was already awarded. We took the settlement and we moved on." A pause that contained years. "I still think about him, though. The one who actually got us out. I think about him a lot." Angela sat in her apartment that night with her notes across the kitchen table and thought about what she had. A deleted comment. A fire marshal's report with an unidentified civilian. 5 survivor accounts that contradicted the official narrative. A 15-year-old commendation built on attribution, rather than eyewitness confirmation. And a video of Patricia Hollins, whose company owned the plant where all of this had happened, striking a security guard in a lobby. She opened her laptop. She searched for Harold Brooks and found nothing useful. No social media, no news mentions, no LinkedIn, no digital presence of the kind that most people accumulated without thinking about it, simply by existing in the modern world. The absence was its own kind of information. People without digital footprints had usually made a choice about that, and the choice usually had a reason. She found Anchor Point Foundation through the Georgia Nonprofit Registry. The 990 filings were public. She read 3 years' worth in 40 minutes. The numbers were remarkable in proportion to the budget. Hundreds of people served, millions recovered for workers, on operating expenses that would have been considered modest for a medium-sized law firm's quarterly overhead. The founder was listed as Harold J. Brooks, with a post office box in West End. She pulled the foundation's case filings through court records. Public. though it took her until midnight to work through the indexing, and found 3 cases in the past 6 years, involving Hollins Group subsidiaries. All 3 had resulted in settlements. All 3 had been filed through the same labor attorney, a woman named Brenda, who worked out of a shared office in East Point. She called Brenda at 12:30 a.m., left a voicemail, sent an email. Then she searched for the connection between Harold J. Brooks and Meridian. And November, and 15 years ago, and found nothing direct, which told her that if Harold Brooks was the person in the fire marshal's report, he had exited that night in exactly the way the report described. Before anyone got his name, she looked at the empty search results for a long time. Then she wrote 2 words in her notebook, underlined them twice, and went to bed. Find him. Donald Thomas found out about the deleted comment at 9 a.m. the following morning, 2 hours after Angela Young's voicemail appeared on Brenda's phone. Though Donald Thomas did not yet know about the voicemail, what he knew was that his assistant had flagged the comment, captured in a screenshot before deletion, circulating in corners of the internet where the Patricia Hollins video was being discussed, with the sustained attention of people who had decided the story wasn't finished yet. The comment said Meridian. He had a corner office in Buckhead. The framed photograph with the governor was on the wall to his left. The safety commendation itself, the actual physical award, heavy acrylic with his name etched into it, was on the shelf behind him, positioned to appear in his background on video calls. He had arranged it that way years ago, deliberately. It was the kind of detail you attended to when something had been part of your identity for long enough that you stopped noticing you were still maintaining it. He told himself, while reading the screenshot, that the comment meant nothing. A deleted comment from an anonymous account was not an investigation. It was not evidence. It was the kind of ambient noise that surrounded any viral story. People looking for angles that mostly led nowhere. He told himself this with the force of a man who had told himself similar things many times, and found that the telling worked, at least for the duration of the morning. Then his phone rang. A name he recognized, a former colleague from the Hollins Industries period, someone who had been in the company during the Meridian years and left 3 years later for a position elsewhere. The call lasted 4 minutes. The former colleague had been contacted by a reporter from the AJC. The reporter had asked about Meridian, about the rescue, about Donald Thomas's presence inside the building that night. After the call ended, Donald Thomas sat very still. He thought about the corridor he had never entered. He thought about the fire marshal's report, which he had read in full at the time and not read since, and which contained a reference he had trusted, over 15 years, would remain the kind of thing that existed in a file and did not migrate into active attention. He thought about the 43 survivors, the people who had come out through a corridor he had never seen, guided by someone he had never met, whose experience of that night was categorically different from the story he had been telling about it. 43 people who had been very quiet for 15 years. He picked up his phone, scrolled to a contact, dialed. The man who answered had been in the Hollins Group's legal department during the Meridian period, and was now a partner at a firm in Midtown. Donald said, his voice carrying the controlled evenness of someone choosing each word the way you chose footing on uncertain ground. I need you to tell me honestly whether there's anything in the old Meridian files that creates exposure. A pause. Then, Donald, why are you asking me this right now? Because a reporter is asking questions. Another pause, longer. What kind of questions? The kind about who was inside the building. The silence that followed carried its own information. Donald Thomas had been in enough rooms over enough years to know what silence meant when it came from a lawyer who was calculating something. This one meant, I was afraid of this. I have been afraid of this for some time, and I am currently deciding whether my next words are going to cost me something. There are memos, the man said finally, internal, from the weeks after. There was a discussion about locating the actual rescuer. The discussion was closed, I know about that. Do you know that Patricia Hollins pulled the full Meridian file 2 days ago? Donald Thomas stopped breathing for approximately 2 seconds. Then he restarted, carefully, The way you restarted systems after an interruption to verify nothing had been lost. That's a different conversation, he said. Yes, the man said. It is. The call ended. Donald Thomas sat in his Buckhead office and looked at the framed photograph and the acrylic award and the view of the city through his window, and he did what he had learned to do in every situation where the walls were moving. He started making calls. Not to lawyers yet, not to PR people. To the people who had been at Meridian in some capacity, who had maintained the silence the story required, who had their own reasons for not having spoken in 15 years, and who he believed, if reminded of those reasons firmly enough, would continue not speaking. He called 7 of them over the course of the afternoon. The message he delivered to each was the same. Calibrated for maximum effect, dressed in the language of shared interest, coming from a place of genuine fear that he had learned over decades to make sound like calm authority. If I go down for this, everyone connected to Meridian goes down with me. He believed this was true. He also believed that belief, delivered with sufficient certainty, could function as a structure between him and what was coming. He did not know, when he made the 7th call, that the person on the other end had their phone set to record. He did not know, finishing that call, and leaning back in his chair and looking at the commendation on his shelf, that the recording was already on its way to an attorney who would spend the next 48 hours deciding what to do with it, before making the call that Donald Thomas would spend the rest of his life wishing had never happened. He sat in his office as the Atlanta afternoon moved outside his window, and told himself the structure would hold. It was the last time he would be able to tell himself that and believe it. Angela Young's piece ran on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the lobby video went viral, front page, above the fold. The kind of placement that editors reserved for stories they believed in completely and expected to outlast the news cycle that produced them. The headline was direct in the way the best headlines were direct. Not clever, not reaching for effect, simply true. The man who saved 43 workers and was never thanked. By 9 a.m. it had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, 180,000. By the time the evening news programs cut to their first commercial breaks, every major outlet in the country had picked up the story, and the names Harold Brooks and Patricia Hollins were appearing in the same sentences on screens from Atlanta to Seattle in ways that nobody had anticipated 6 weeks earlier, and everybody was now treating as inevitable. Angela had spent 11 days on the piece after locating Harold Brooks through a source at the labor attorney's office. A cell number she'd called twice before he answered on the 3rd attempt on a Tuesday evening when he was sitting at his desk in West End after his shift. He had agreed to speak with her, on the record, after she explained what she already had and what she intended to write regardless. He had said, then write it accurately, and she had. She had spoken to 14 survivors of the Meridian fire, 11 of whom agreed to be named. She had obtained and verified the fire marshal's report, the internal Hollins memos, the commendation documentation, and a sworn statement from Darnell Cooper, 71 years old, retired safety inspector, living in Augusta, who had been awake since 2 a.m. the morning. She called him because he'd seen the video 3 weeks earlier and hadn't slept properly since. Darnell Cooper had not asked for anonymity. He had not asked for review of how his name would appear. He had said, his voice, carrying the steadiness of someone who has made a decision after a long time and is not going to reverse it. I was there when they chose him. I knew it was wrong. I signed anyway, because I was 3 years from my pension, and I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as everyone was safe. A pause that contained 15 years. It mattered. It mattered to the people who were in that building. And it's mattered to me every day since. The morning the piece ran, Angela's phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. and didn't stop for 3 days. Donald Thomas read it before he got out of bed, once fast and once slow, the way he had learned to read things that had his name in them. First for the immediate damage, then for the specific words and what, if anything, could be done about them. He was 63 years old and had been in enough situations requiring management to know the difference between a problem with a solution and a problem that had moved past that stage entirely. This was the latter. The piece named him 18 times. It quoted the fire marshal's report directly. It quoted Darnell Cooper by name and at length. It quoted 11 survivors, all on record, all describing the same corridor and the same young man, and the absence of Donald Thomas from any first-hand account of what had happened inside. It reproduced, with permission and in full, the relevant section of the page 47 memo, the deprioritization language, the signature line. His name was on the signature. His lawyer called at 7:15. The conversation covered, in the language of a man who charged $400 an hour and did not use words he wasn't being paid for, the following. The recorded phone call Donald had made to 7 former colleagues was in the possession of the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, submitted by one of those 7. Donald did not yet know which one. Along with a formal complaint alleging witness intimidation in connection with an investigation that had been opened quietly the previous week. The recorded call, his lawyer said, with the flatness of someone who had delivered terminal diagnoses before and had never found a better way to do it, was not good. Donald sat on the edge of his bed in his house in Sandy Springs and looked at the framed photograph on his dresser. Himself and his wife at their daughter's college graduation, 7 years ago, the specific happiness of a day when everything was uncomplicated, and tried to locate the certainty that had carried him through 63 years of forward motion. He couldn't find it. He had built the story carefully, not all at once. That was the thing people didn't understand about how these constructions worked. Nobody sat down and decided to fabricate something wholesale. What happened was smaller and more human, and in some ways worse. A chaotic night. An opportunity that presented itself in the confusion. A choice made in the gap between what happened and what was reported, and then a decade and a half of incremental reinforcement. Each retelling adding a layer. Each award and profile and speech building the structure higher, until the structure itself became load-bearing. Until the story held up things that would collapse without it. He called his lawyer back at 7:30 and said, "Tell me what cooperating looks like." Patricia Hollins read the piece at her desk, having been sent the link by Kevin Moore at 6 a.m. with no commentary. Just the URL and the headline and the word read beneath it in lowercase, which was not how Kevin communicated and therefore told her everything she needed to know about what was in it before she clicked. She read it twice. Then she sat at her desk and looked at her city and thought about the 11 minutes she had spent alone in the second-floor conference room after Harold Brooks left, and the 3 decisions she had made in that time, and whether what she was reading now changed any of them. It didn't change them. It confirmed them. She called Stephanie Harris at 7:15. "The statement goes out this morning," she said. "My words. No framework, no legal review before it posts." Stephanie was quiet for a moment that contained significant professional tension. "Patricia, my words, Stephanie. I'll send them to you in an hour." She hung up and started writing. Outside the glass, Atlanta moved the way it always moved, without waiting, without pausing to register what was happening in the buildings that defined its skyline, without any awareness that in a corner office on the 38th floor of one of those buildings, a woman who had spent 20 years telling one story about herself had just started writing a different one. The cursor blinked on the screen. She typed the first sentence, then the second. Then, for the first time in a very long time, she didn't stop to consider how it would land. She just kept going. 3 months after Angela Young's piece ran, Fulton County Courthouse opened its doors at 7:45 a.m. to a line that had formed before 6. Not the kind of line that formed outside courthouses when a celebrity was on trial, when people came for the spectacle and the chance to say they had been present. This line was different, quieter. People who had driven from Marietta and Smyrna and Savannah and Augusta, who had taken days off work they couldn't afford to miss, who had arranged childcare and ride shares and early morning alarms. Standing in the October cold with coffee cups and the particular stillness of people who had been waiting a long time for a specific thing and had learned, over the years of waiting, not to let themselves want it too openly. Courtroom C, 4th floor. Every seat occupied by 8:45 a.m. Reporters in the gallery with the contained energy of people who understood they were covering something that would outlast the day. cameras in the permitted positions. Survivors of the Meridian fire distributed through the rows in clusters. Some of them meeting each other for the first time in 15 years, some of them having maintained contact over the intervening time in the careful way. People maintained contact when they shared something that had no clean name, and that they had never fully been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there. Harold Brooks arrived at 8:52 and sat in the gallery, third row from the back, left side. He wore dark clothes, clean, without any bid for attention. Not his uniform. He was not working. But the same quality of presence he brought to everything. The sense of a man who occupied whatever space he was in without announcing the occupation. Jeffrey Lewis sat 2 seats to his left. This was where Jeffrey had been every time Harold had been anywhere in the past 3 months. Not because Harold had asked, not because Jeffrey had offered and been accepted, but because Jeffrey Lewis had made a decision somewhere around the morning, in the service corridor, that proximity was the least he could provide, and he was going to provide at least the least. He had brought 2 coffees. He handed one to Harold without a word. Harold took it without a word. They had developed over 3 months, a working language that used very few actual words and was more precise for it. Angela Young sat in the press gallery with a notebook open on her knee, a habit she had never broken in 22 years. The physical act of writing, still the thing that organized her thinking more effectively than any digital tool. She had been in this courthouse before, covering other things, and she knew the specific quality of attention that Courtroom C developed when it was focused. Today it was very focused. Patricia Hollins sat at the respondents' table with her legal team, present voluntarily. A fact she had made explicit in filings submitted the previous month that had surprised everyone who read them, including her own attorneys, who had advised against it, and been overruled with a calm that left no room for further discussion. Donald Thomas sat at the other table. He had aged in the 3 months since the piece ran, not dramatically, in the way that men aged when the energy required to hold something in place was no longer being spent on that project. Some structural effort had been discontinued, and without it, the years showed in a way they hadn't before. His attorney sat beside him with the contained expression of someone who had advised a guilty plea and been relieved when the client finally agreed. The judge, a compact woman in her late 50s named Kathleen Robinson, who had been on the Fulton County bench for 11 years, and who had read the Meridian file herself, cover to cover, before accepting the case, called the room to order at 9 a.m. precisely. Jeffrey Lewis was the first witness called. He walked to the stand the way he walked everywhere, with the economy of a man who had learned that every step was a choice, and that unnecessary choices were a form of waste. He settled into the chair, looked at the room without particular expression, and waited. The prosecutor, Sandra Anderson, 16 years with the DA's office, the kind of attorney who prepared so thoroughly that she already knew every answer before she asked any question. Walked him through the foundation first, his background, his time at Atlanta Fire Rescue, Station 19, the 12 years and the shoulder injury that ended them, the specifics of his training that made his observations under the conditions of the Meridian fire, not merely personal recollection, but professional assessment. Then she asked him about the night. Jeffrey described it the way he had described it once before, in a cinderblock corridor with Harold, directly. In the sequence, it had actually happened, without reaching for effect, because the facts didn't need any. The smoke, the heat signature of a building communicating its structural status to someone trained to listen. The East Side boiler room, where he had been trapped behind a door that had shifted in the frame from heat expansion, 3 inches of clearance that was not enough, and then a hand on his shoulder and a voice saying, "This way, stay low," and a man moving through conditions that professional firefighters with full equipment were struggling in, moving as though the conditions were simply the conditions, not a reason to stop. He described the wound. When the debris came down, what it looked like. The fact that the young man did not break stride when the metal tore across his forearm. He described the corridor, which appeared on no rescue map he had ever seen for that building, which he had subsequently attempted to locate in official documentation, and found not to exist in any record. He described watching Harold Brooks. 23 months ago, pick up Patricia Hollins's phone from the lobby floor of Hollins Group and sets it on the counter with the care of someone who made a practice of handling difficult things carefully. Sandra Anderson looked at her notes, though she didn't need them. In your professional judgment, 12 years as a firefighter, trained in exactly these conditions, was what you've described an act of exceptional courage? Jeffrey Lewis considered the question the way he considered things that deserved consideration, without rushing toward the answer. It required everything a person has, he said. I've been in a lot of buildings. I've seen a lot of people under pressure. What he did that night was the kind of thing you can't train someone to do. You either have it or you don't, and most people don't. The defense attorney's cross-examination lasted 9 minutes and produced nothing that altered the weight of what Jeffrey had put in the room. The survivors came next, not all 11. 5 had agreed to testify in person, the others providing written statements entered into the record. They came to the stand one at a time, across the better part of the morning, and what they produced collectively was not drama but accumulation. 5 independent accounts, each describing the same corridor, the same wound, the same departure before thanks could be given, built something in the courtroom that was harder to argue against than any single piece of evidence because it didn't feel like evidence. It felt like memory. It felt like truth. Brian Thompson came third. He ran his equipment repair shop in Marietta now and walked with a slight favoring of his left side from an injury that had nothing to do with Meridian. He was 51 years old, and he had spent 15 years carrying something without anywhere to put it. When he described the moment, he realized the young man who had guided him out was no longer in the crowd outside the building. When he described turning around and scanning faces and finding only strangers where there should have been someone he needed to thank, he stopped speaking for 4 seconds. Not grief exactly. Something more specific than grief. The shape of a debt that had never been given a name or an address. In the press gallery, Angela Young had stopped writing. Her pen was still on the page. She was just listening. Each of the 5 witnesses, when asked whether they had seen Donald Thomas inside the building that night, gave the same answer in different words, nor outside. Parking lot. He had a clipboard. No. Donald Thomas did not look at the witnesses. He looked at his hands, or at his attorney, or at the middle distance that people looked at when they were managing something private in a room that had stopped being private. By noon, the defense filed the paperwork Sandra Anderson had been expecting for 3 days. Donald Thomas was withdrawing his previous statements. He would cooperate fully with the investigation. He acknowledged that his public account of the Meridian rescue had been materially inaccurate, that he had knowingly allowed the inaccurate account to be attributed to him, and that this had formed the basis of professional recognition he had received over 15 years. He did not look, when he signed, like a man who had been caught. He looked like a man who was finally setting down something that had been heavier than he'd admitted for longer than he'd acknowledged to anyone, including himself. Which was, in its way, a kind of honesty that arrived 15 years too late and still arrived. The judge called a recess, and the courtroom exhaled. In the gallery, Darnell Cooper, 71 years old, who had driven up from Augusta the previous evening and stayed with his daughter in Decatur, because he'd told her he needed to be here, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, but that she had accepted without pushing, leaned forward, and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. He had signed his name to paperwork 15 years ago and carried that signature every day since. He had called Angela Young at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday because he'd been awake since 2 a.m. and had decided, somewhere in those hours, that he was done carrying it. He didn't feel lighter yet, but he thought he might, eventually. Harold was called to the stand at 2:15 p.m. He walked through the courtroom the way he walked through every space, as though it were simply where he was, not something to perform for or against. He settled into the chair and looked at Sandra Anderson and waited. She asked him to describe the events of November 15 years ago. She asked it without preamble, because she had read enough of Anchor Point's public filings and spoken to Harold twice in preparation for this day to understand that preamble was not something he required or found useful. Harold described the night in the way he had described it only a handful of times in 15 years. To people who needed the facts, in the order they occurred, without elaboration that served anything other than clarity, he had been in the vicinity of the Meridian plant on other business. He had heard sounds consistent with a structure in significant distress and people who needed direction. He had entered the building through a service access point on the east side. He had located workers on the third floor and guided them through a service corridor that connected to an exterior exit not included in the main egress plan. He had repeated this process until the floor was clear. He had confirmed before leaving that everyone he had guided out had reached the staging area. He had left. Sandra Anderson asked about the wound. He said, "A section of ceiling gave way. Metal debris. The wound was significant. I had it treated at Grady Memorial that night," she asked. "Why didn't you remain at the scene? Why didn't you give your name to the official record?" Harold was quiet for a moment. The courtroom, which had been the kind of quiet that developed when a room was paying close attention, went quieter still. The particular silence of people who have stopped shifting in their seats. "Because when I came out," he said, "there were people who needed someone to help them figure out what happened next. Their medical care, their documentation, their claims. That work was going to need doing, and I was standing there, and I could do it. And if I was in front of cameras, I wasn't doing it." He paused. The building was clear. That was what mattered. The defense had no questions. Darnell Cooper took the stand after Harold, and what he gave the courtroom was the inside of the decision. The room where it had been made, the people who had been in it, the specific calculation that had produced a false record and a false name attached to an act of courage that had never belonged to either. He described it without melodrama, in the plain language of a man who had rehearsed the telling in his head for 15 years and was finally giving it to the room it was always meant for. He said, "I signed because I was 3 years from my pension, and I told myself the important thing was that everyone was safe, that the credit didn't matter as long as the outcome was right." He looked at his hands. "I've thought about that reasoning every day since. I don't believe it anymore. I'm not sure I believed it then." When Darnell stepped down, the judge looked at the room for a moment, with the expression of someone who had seen enough human behavior from this bench to not be surprised by much of it, and who was, nonetheless, taking a breath before the next thing. She asked if there were any final statements relevant to the proceedings before she continued. Patricia Hollins stood up. Her attorney's hand moved toward her arm, reflexive, quickly withdrawn when she stepped away from it. She stood at the respondent's table and faced the room, and what she did next was not the thing her legal team had recommended, was not the thing her PR director had drafted, was not the thing that any framework she had ever used for managing public situations would have produced. She spoke without notes. She said that she had struck a man in her lobby because she had looked at him and not seen him. She said this not as a legal statement and not as a managed acknowledgement. As a fact about herself, that she had spent 3 months examining from every angle and that she intended to spend considerably longer correcting. She said the company her father had built, and that she had grown, had survived a catastrophe 15 years ago, in part because of what Harold Brooks had done on a Tuesday night in November, and that the company had known this, had documented it, had considered its obligation to acknowledge it, and had filed that obligation under a single bureaucratic line and moved on to the next calendar item. She said she was responsible for that, not personally. She had been building her early career in those years, not running the company. But she carried the company, and the company carried that decision, and carrying the company meant carrying what it had done and what it had failed to do. That was what carrying meant. She announced the Worker Compensation Fund, $2.3 million, administered by an independent committee, available to workers with claims against any Hollins Group subsidiary, going back to 2018 that had been denied or settled for less than the documented injury warranted. She announced the contribution to Anchor Point Foundation, $1.5 million. No conditions attached, no co-branding requirement, no relationship between the money and the company's public profile. She announced the internal restructuring, a worker safety department reporting directly to her office, not through the operations chain, with authority to flag and escalate claims that had been rejected without adequate review. Then she turned to Harold, not performing the turn, not making it theatrical, simply directing herself toward the person she was addressing. "I can't give you 15 years, she said, and her voice held the quality of someone who has finished calculating and arrived at something true. "I can't give you the recognition that should have come when it was owed. I can't undo a single day of what you built alone when you should have had resources. What I can give you is this. The company sees you now. I see you now. And that is going to mean something different for every person who comes after you." The room was still. Harold looked at Patricia Hollins from the witness stand with the clear and level attention of a man who was deciding what a thing was worth and what it was going to cost him. And whether the cost was one he was willing to pay, he said, "I accept that." A pause that held more than the words on either side of it. "Now use it for the people I can't reach alone." He looked down at his left hand then, not because he was thinking about the scar, not consciously, but because his hand knew things the rest of him was still catching up to. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked up. The courtroom breathed. The judge allowed a moment that was longer than procedural necessity required, and then she proceeded. Donald Thomas was formally charged with fraud and filing false documentation in connection with the commendation process. Charges supported by the recorded call, the internal memos, the sworn statement from Darnell Cooper, and the volume of survivor testimony that had accumulated with the momentum of something that had been waiting a long time for an opening. His attorney had already filed the guilty plea paperwork. The sentencing hearing would be scheduled separately, the acrylic award on Donald Thomas's shelf in Buckhead. Harold learned this later, from a detail in a follow-up piece Angela wrote 3 weeks after the hearing, had been taken down the morning the original article ran. Not by Donald, Gawk, by the assistant, who had worked alongside the story for years, without having the version of it that was true, who had walked into the office that Thursday morning, read the piece on her phone in the parking garage before Namaj before coming upstairs, and taken the award off the shelf and put it in a box in the storage room without saying anything to anyone. She had not been asked to do it, she just had. The courtroom emptied in layers. Reporters first to move and last to stop moving. Survivors clustering in the hallway outside, in the configuration of people who shared something they'd been carrying separately for a long time and were now, tentatively, finding words for together. Harold came through the main doors and found Jeffrey Lewis waiting on the other side, which was where Jeffrey had taken to being. Outside the room, present, not in the way. Jeffrey handed him a cup of coffee from the cart near the elevator bank. Harold took it. The coffee was medium and unremarkable and exactly what was needed. Jeffrey said, "How are you?" Harold said. "Tired, yeah." They stood in the hallway for a moment. Two men, with a 15-year-old night between them in a courtroom they'd just come out of, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with more than it required. Harold said, "Keisha Dillard's case." Jeffrey looked at him. "The woman with the spinal injury, the insurance company called back this morning. They're opening a full review. Brenda thinks we can settle before it goes to litigation." Harold drank the coffee. "She has a 7-year-old, I know," Jeffrey said. "You've mentioned her." A pause. "Twice." Harold said nothing. "When does she need someone to drive her to the review meeting?" Jeffrey said. "I have Tuesdays and Thursdays now." Harold looked at him. "You don't have to." "I have Tuesdays and Thursdays," Jeffrey said again, patient and settled, the voice of a man who had made a decision and had no interest in revisiting it. Harold nodded. "I'll let you know." Angela Young found him near the elevator bank while he was finishing the coffee. She had her notebook and her phone and the expression of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided, standing here, that this was it. "5 minutes," she said. "Off the record if you want." "But I'd rather on." Harold looked at her for a moment. He had read her piece, all of it, twice, carefully, the way he read things that had his name in them. For accuracy. For what was true and what was inference, and what was editorial characterization dressed as fact. The piece had been, as nearly as he could determine, accurate. She had not invented his motivations. She had not put words in his mouth she hadn't confirmed. She had reported what could be reported, and been honest about the limits of what she could reach. On the record, he said. She asked him 3 questions. The first was about anchor point, what he needed, what the next phase looked like, what the additional resources from Hollins Group would make possible. He answered without hesitation. 2 additional staff, a proper office, with a phone line and a street address people could find. The ability to take cases from states adjacent to Georgia, where workers were currently falling through the same gaps, with no one positioned to catch them. The second was about Donald Thomas. Whether he had carried anger about the misattribution, whether 15 years of another man's name on his night had cost him something he wanted to name. He thought about this. He gave it the consideration it deserved, rather than the deflection that would have been easier. I don't carry it like that, he said. I spent some time with it early on, when the story started being told in the wrong direction, and I could see it happening. And I chose not to intervene. I made peace with that choice because it was the choice I needed to make to do the work I needed to do. The anger, if there was anger, stopped being useful. So I put it down. He paused. What I do carry is the memory of what it feels like to not have anyone. To be inside a system that was built to minimize you and not have a single person who knows how to navigate it, standing on your side. That I carry because it keeps me going back. The third question was the one Angela had been building toward since the first phone call she'd placed to the post office box in West End. The one she had written in her notebook and underlined twice the night before. She said, Harold finished the coffee, set the cup on the ledge beside the elevator bank, looked at the question the way he looked at things that deserved his full attention. Stop deciding what someone's is worth before you've looked at them, he said. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. Not the fire, not the nonprofit, not the building or the company or any of the rest of it. The moment before all of it. Somebody looked at a person and decided, in the space of a single second, that they already knew. And everything that followed came from that moment. He looked at the elevator doors. The world has too many moments like that. Too many people looking without seeing. Too many people walking past someone every morning because they've already decided that person doesn't matter, without ever examining when or why they made that decision, or whether it was ever true. He looked back at Angela. That's what I want people to take, not my name. That, Angela wrote it down, every word. Darnell Cooper found Harold as the hallway was thinning out. He was 71 and walked carefully, and had the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and now, standing here, had decided the rehearsed version wasn't right. He said, I'm sorry for what I signed, for what I let stand. Harold looked at him. You came forward, 15 years late? Yes, Harold said. But you came. He extended his hand. Darnell Cooper shook it and held on for a moment longer than a handshake required, and then let go, and Harold walked toward the exit. And the courthouse held Darnell Cooper in its hallway for a while longer, and he stood there with the feeling of something he'd been carrying for a very long time having been, if not removed, at least acknowledged by the person it had belonged to. Which was, he found, enough. 6 months passed, the way months passed, when they were full of things that mattered. Not quickly and not slowly, but with the particular weight of time being put toward something real. Anchor Point Foundation opened its first dedicated office in late spring. A ground floor space in West End. 3 rooms, a phone line with a real hold system, a small waiting area with chairs that Harold had purchased from a furniture liquidator in Doraville, repaired himself over a weekend with a screwdriver, and a replacement part he'd ordered online for $11. The address appeared on the website for the first time. The website had a new page, staff, 2 names besides Harold's. A third joining in the fall. Jeffrey Lewis drove Keisha Dillard to 4 meetings in 2 months. He had resigned from Hollins Group in December, not without extended conversation, and not without Patricia making clear that his position was there for as long as he wanted it. He had thanked her with the formality of someone who had spent 10 years learning to be professionally gracious, and then left with the lightness of someone who had finally located the right next thing. The insurance review for Keisha resulted in a settlement. Not everything Brenda had asked for. It never was, but more than the original offer, and enough for the surgical procedure her previous claim had been denied, with something remaining. She called Harold the morning the check cleared. The call was 4 minutes long. She cried for the first 2. Harold said very little and listened to all of it, which was what she needed, and what he had learned over years to recognize as the difference between what people needed and what they said they needed, which were often not the same thing. Her daughter's name was Imani. Harold learned this on the 3rd call, when Keisha phoned to tell him she had started a part-time administrative job and Imani had just lost her 2nd front tooth, and she thought Harold should know. He wrote Imani's name on a post-it note and put it in the corner of his monitor in the West End office, beside the names of 4 other children whose parents had been given a fair process. He looked at those names every morning when he'd sat down. They were not there to make him feel good about the work. They were there to remind him what the work was for. Donald Thomas entered a guilty plea in November. The sentencing hearing produced 18 months, suspended in part with financial penalties tied to the fraudulent benefits he had received across 15 years. His Buckhead office closed the same week. The framed photograph with the governor was not, to anyone's knowledge, displayed anywhere again. His assistant, the one who had taken the award off the shelf the morning the article ran, had already found a new position by then at a firm across town that didn't have any photographs of politicians on the walls, and she had been quietly relieved about that. Darnell Cooper called Harold after the sentencing. He didn't say much. Harold didn't say much either, but before he hung up, Darnell said that he was sleeping better than he had in 15 years. Harold said he was glad. The call ended and Harold put down the phone and went back to the case file he'd been working on. A construction worker in Savannah, 34 years old, whose fall from scaffolding had been classified by his employer as voluntary misconduct within 72 hours, denying his claim before the bruising had even fully come in. Kevin Moore had moved on in the spring. He had come to Patricia's office one afternoon, in March, and told her he had accepted a position at a smaller firm. Something he said he'd been thinking about for a while, for reasons he'd been working through. Patricia had listened and told him she understood and meant it. And then she had said, "You were good at this. Whatever you do next, that stays true." Kevin had nodded and looked at his shoes for a moment, in the way that young men looked at their shoes when they were trying to receive something gracefully, and then left. His replacement, a young man named Terrence, who had started in January, was considerably less nervous than Kevin had been in his first month, and asked better questions from the start. Patricia Hollins met directly with her worker safety team every month. Not through reports, not through Kevin's or Terrence's summaries. In person in a conference room on the 8th floor, with the people who were doing the actual work of review in the room where the actual work happened. She did not always like what she heard. She had come to understand over several of these meetings that this was the point of hearing it, that the value of the information was in direct proportion to how much it cost her to sit with it. She had one recurring item on her agenda, outstanding claims. She reviewed each one, asked the same question every time, the one she had started asking the week after the hearing, when she'd pulled the full claims backlog and seen not just the individual cases but the pattern they made together. The outline of a system that had been built, without anyone's explicit intention, to move injuries from the visible column to the resolved column as efficiently as possible, in ways that served the company, rather than the worker. The question was, what would it take to make this right? Not what are we legally required to do? Not what can we settle for? What would it take to make it right? The answer was different every time. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was acknowledgement. Sometimes it was a phone call from a human being, instead of a letter from a claims department. Sometimes, and this was the one that surprised her most, it was just someone saying, "We believe you," out loud, in a room, to a person who had not had that said to them in all the months they'd been fighting. She had hired 2 new staff for the worker safety department. She had found them through Anchor Point. Harold had a working knowledge of exactly which advocates and attorneys in the Southeast were doing the most effective work with the fewest resources and the most integrity, and Patricia had asked him for that knowledge directly, on a call that lasted 22 minutes, and that Harold had taken from the West End office, sitting at his desk with the post-it notes in the corner of his monitor, and the case files stacked in the order he'd established. When the office opened, she did not offer him a board seat again. He had declined it once, and she had learned enough about how he operated to understand that offering it twice would demonstrate she had missed the point entirely. What she offered instead was something he accepted: a standing contribution in the annual budget for Anchor Point, with no conditions, no co-branding, no relationship between the money and anything the company needed from him. Simply a contribution to work that was being done and deserved to be sustained. He put the first check directly into Keisha Dillard's remaining case costs, the Savannah construction workers' filing fees, and the operational overhead that had been running on Harold's personal checking account for 8 years, without complaint and without anyone knowing to complain about it. On a Wednesday morning, in March, Harold Brooks walked into the Hollins Group lobby at 7:29 and took his position 6 feet from the revolving door, left side, in the way he had stood there for 2 years and 9 months and some number of days that he had stopped counting around the time the West End office opened, and his time became more precisely useful when directed at other things. The lobby had the same marble, the same recycled air, the same energy of a building at the beginning of its working hours. People moving through with their coffee and their phones and their varying degrees of readiness for what the day was going to ask of them. Harold watched all of it, the way he always did. The woman in the blue blazer checked her reflection in the elevator doors. The older gentleman from the 14th floor held the door for the person behind him without looking back. The mail courier took the stairs. He noticed them the way he always did, with the full attention of someone who had made a practice of looking and had never once regretted it. At 7:52, the revolving door turned. Patricia Hollins came through. One assistant, Terrence, who had learned in 3 months that the most useful thing he could do in the first 15 minutes of any morning was stay half a step behind and not talk. Jeffrey Lewis was not there. The position had been filled by a woman named Sandra, who was 53 and had spent 20 years in private security, and who Patricia had hired specifically because Sandra had, in her interview, asked 3 questions about workplace protocol that suggested she understood the difference between protecting someone from danger and insulating them from inconvenience. Patricia crossed the lobby at the pace she always crossed it, the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and the resources to get there. She was looking at her phone. She was, as Terrence had observed and filed away, almost always looking at her phone in the first 2 minutes after entering the building. And then she looked up, and she looked at Harold. Directly, the way she had been looking at him since the second-floor conference room, since the courthouse hallway, since the first worker safety meeting, where she had looked around the table and understood what it meant to actually see the room you were in rather than the room you expected to be in. She said, "Good morning, Harold." 2 words, first name. No performance in it, no self-consciousness about the shift. Those words represented from 2 years and 9 months of walking through without registering him as a person with a name. Just the words, offered to the person they were meant for, with the directness of someone who had decided this was simply who she was going to be. Harold said, "Good morning, Miss Hollins." She went to the executive elevator. The doors opened and closed. The lobby moved on. Harold stood at his post and watched it move and thought about the case on his desk at the West End office. A woman in Columbus, Georgia, 51 years old, who had worked in a textile processing facility for 17 years and been told, after a repetitive stress injury took function from her right hand, that the condition was pre-existing and the company bore no responsibility. She had 3 letters of denial and a medical report and a daughter in college on a partial scholarship, and no money for an attorney. and no idea that there was a number she could call. She had found Anchor Point through a flyer someone had left in the waiting room of a free clinic in Muscogee County. She had called on a Tuesday afternoon, nervous enough that she apologized twice in the first 30 seconds for taking up someone's time. Harold had called her back the same evening, had listened for 22 minutes without interruption, had asked 5 questions and taken 4 pages of notes in the handwriting he used only for this work, not quite print and not quite cursive, fast and legible and entirely his own, developed over 8 years of writing down things that mattered. He had told her, "We're going to look at this. We're going to find out what you're owed, and we're going to help you ask for it. It may take time. It won't take forever." She had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you helping me?" "You don't know me," Harold had said, not with drama, not with the weight of a line being delivered, but with the plain steadiness of something he had believed for 15 years and did not need to announce. "Because you called, and because the work that needs doing is right in front of me." That's enough reason. The lobby turned over. New arrivals through the revolving door. The barista on the mezzanine level starting her second hour, the rush having passed, and the room settling into the long, productive middle of a working day. People who would not be in any newspaper. People whose names would not be in any record. People doing things that mattered without any expectation that the mattering would be noticed. Harold noticed them. He noticed them the way he noticed everything. Completely, without announcement, without needing the noticing to be seen. The revolving door turned. A young man Harold didn't recognize came through. Knew, probably, the way you could tell from the slight hesitation before he committed to a direction, the look of someone still learning the geography of a place. He was maybe 22. He wore the kind of clothes you wore when you'd made an effort for a job you needed. He stopped near the security desk, uncertain. Harold caught his eye, gave him a small nod toward the desk. The young man nodded back and went there and was directed, and found his way, and moved on. Harold returned his attention to the door. Outside, Atlanta moved the way it always moved, without pausing, without announcing its intentions. Building and tearing down and building again, with the momentum of a city that had decided, a long time ago, that stopping was not available as an option. He had lived here his whole life. Knew it in the way you knew a place that had shaped you before you were old enough to notice the shaping happening. He thought about the Columbus woman and her 3 letters of denial and her daughter's partial scholarship. He thought about the Savannah construction worker and the scaffolding fall and the claim closed in 72 hours. He thought about Keisha Dillard and Imani and the second front tooth. He thought about the work that needed doing, which was always more than what had been done, which was the only thing about the work that never changed. The door turned again. Harold stood at his post, full attention on the room, full attention on the people moving through it, because that had always been, and would always be, what it meant to be the person at the door.